r/AskReddit. Do you know anyone who's ever committed murder? What's the story? One of the most intelligent men I knew, my former boss, passed away of old age last year when he was 16, which would have been in the 1940s. His mostly absentee, degenerate, doper father showed up, took our younger sister in the garage, and beat her almost bloody with a belt. Arrived just in time to roll up the garage door and told the old man, "You ever touch her again, I'll kill you." The next day after school, he comes home to hear his sister screaming in the garage. He goes in the house, grabs dad's shotgun, rolls up the door, tells sister to run, and shoots and kills the sumbitch. Was taken to juvenile trial. Sister was sent to live with an aunt. At trial, the local Baptist pastor told the small town judge he and his wife would legally adopt. Our judge declared the killing justified, and grew up safe and loved, and got a degree in psychology. He told me the adoptive parents were his real parents. So I was newly pregnant and meeting the rest of my family in-laws during a holiday gathering. I met the aunt who used to be a rising star in LA as a model featured in magazines. If I recall correctly, she spent 17 years in prison because she was a drug mule transporting drugs during her modeling gigs. Anyway, I also met her boyfriend. He was charming, and my 6-year-old son loved him. Heck, even I was swooned by his charisma. When I left the family dinner, I was informed he was recently out of prison because he murdered 2 men and placed them into barrels before dumping them into the sea. Maybe he's a changed man. A year later, I realized I haven't heard about this man in a while. When I asked the in-laws, there was a sudden silence. That's when I found out he murdered another man and tried dumping the body with the same method. You'd think he would have learned his lesson by now. Awkward part is, he left behind a barrel in the house where I'm staying at. It took me 2 years before I pried it open out of curiosity. It was camping gear, thank you baby Jesus. Guy across the hall was a cool guy, super laid back, worked a restaurant, and always brought us leftover food, which was cool cause we were all poor college students. Used to go over there and play retro video games and drink beers. He'd always tell us about his girlfriend, who was so busy with school he hardly saw her. Never thought much about it. Turns out she dumped him a while back and he'd been stalking her. Ended up going to her house one night and very brutally murdering her while she was on the phone with her parents. Sentenced to life in prison. I knew a man years ago who killed a man in a bar fight. He hit the person in the head with a pool ball. He was tried and convicted of negligent homicide and served 18 months in prison. I knew him 15 years later, and he had never been arrested for anything since and freely admitted he was wrong. It was a heat of the moment thing. He said he never thought it would have killed someone. I met a lady one time who told me her husband had abused her for years before she got away from him. She had a restraining order and kept a weapon on her due to being scared of not being in a position to defend herself. One day she was at the gas station and he pulled up to the pump right on the other side of her. He came at her and she bent down and pulled the knife out of the holster. When she came up, she stabbed him in the heart from under his ribs. He died and she walked free. My best friend in high school had a boyfriend who creeped me the duck out. I had been slowly removing myself from our friendship because of his influence when I got a call from her telling me that he was on his way to pick her up and that he'd murdered his parents. I told her to hang up and call 911. His mom survived multiple gunshots. Sadly his dad did not. I'm very interested in the rest of this story. Did she call 911? Did he hurt her? Did your friendship recover? She did call. They intercepted him about half a mile away from her house. I can actually remember seeing his car on the news that night. Thankfully they didn't live closer to each other, maybe 20 minutes apart. She wasn't physically hurt. I think his intention was likely to kill her mom and run away with her. Her mom had called me a few times before this happened hoping I would talk some sense into her. And no, the friendship never recovered. We were sort of rebuilding it when she started talking about him again. Between that and me immediately calling her mom to tell her the friendship ended for good. I went out with a guy twice when I was senior in high school. A year after I graduated he killed 3 of my former classmates while on dates. He was only convicted of 2 though. My father killed my mother and made it look like a suicide. He admitted it to my sister after he had a stroke and lost his ability to filter his mouth. She was getting 100% disability from the Veterans Administration as was he. He liked to spend his money on beer and hookers. Saw him once when she was hospitalized, wanted her to cover the bills. He got nearly as much in a widower's benefit from the VA as she was getting for disability. He was bragging the day before the funeral about how much he would be getting. Who does that? He was so greedy and sadistic, I knew he did it all along. He'd abuse my mother to the point that she would break down and have to be hospitalized for up to a year. She was disabled due to having contracted malaria during World War II in the Philippines and having a high fever that normally kills, but in her case she survived with severe nervous system problems. Very sensitive and vulnerable. He sent her to the hospital many times in the 14 years that they were married and forged his name to her savings, where the VA had deposited her checks previously while she was hospitalized. He stole her money every time, and yet the police believed him when he lied and said he never abused her or anyone else. He would beat all of us when we lived with him. My grandmother hired an attorney to go talk to the investigators several months after the funeral, but they said the case was closed and refused to hear anything. My daughter shot and killed her abusive ex-boyfriend in front of me. She had come to stay with us to get safe from him. Every day we caught him in the yard, every day we called the cops, every day they did nothing. When he showed up and tried to force his way into the house, daughter grabbed a gun. Told the cops she had a gun. The cops are 2 miles away. They never show. 20 minutes later he gets sick of waiting on her to give up and charges her. She shoots him at close range. I tell the police she has shot him and he is on the ground. 15 minutes later, one lone patrolman shows up, sees him on the ground and says what's the matter with him. No ambulance ever showed up, even though he was alive for a while after he was shot. They had a restraining order on him. We had called daily for a week. They still arrested her for killing him. You know how a grand jury meets once a month to decide if they will proceed with prosecution? They didn't decide for 2 years. Then they let her go as a good shoot. They could have told us that before we spent $20,000 on a defense attorney, and no, we didn't get the money back, even though he never had to defend her. My late mother's boyfriend at the time. He randomly attacked and killed a woman walking her dog with his bare hands. He was caught inside of a couple days, but what really stuck with me was how he came home with his hands beat up, saying that he fell while on a hike. Obviously it was right after the murder, but we could not have known that at the time. He was completely chill in every respect, while my mom helped clean him up. In retrospect it was a bit of a stretch to say it was from a hiking accident, but he sold it well, and I was young and my mom would not have any reason to expect murder of all things. I'm getting ready for school and a couple cops show up to the house asking about my mom's boyfriend. He did not come home the night prior, and as this was back before the days of cell phones, she was concerned. I went to school, but was pulled out early by my uncle, where he told me my mom was going to let me know what was happening. I get to my aunt's house and she tells me what happened. My mom was devastated. We would see the story on the news that night and they showed his prior convictions. He was arrested several times for SA and violent crimes. We had no idea. We even met his extended family. They never said a word about his past. I don't know that we were ever in danger, but my mom and him dated for 3 years, lived together for 2 years. He thankfully was caught, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison. Hung out a bunch of times with my friend and his co-worker who lived in a pretty sketchy neighborhood. At some point it came up that several years before he was walking home and a guy tried to rob him at knife point. It turned into a scuffle and the co-worker turned the knife and drove it into the robber with what turned out to be a fatal stab wound. The cops obviously got involved. The co-worker had never been arrested, while the robber had a long criminal history including violent acts, and so there were never any charges. He didn't like to talk about it though, kinda ducked him up for a good while even though he was in the right. Knew a really nice foreign guy who ran a local restaurant. He was well known and liked in the town. Found out years later he strangled his 2 kids and killed his wife before killing himself. Still can't make sense of it to this day. I graduated high school in 2001. A guy in the class of 1998 was a wrestler and overall a popular guy. He was huge and even in 2019 still held the school deadlift record for his weight class. We will call him Frank. Well, I was working as a corrections officer in 2004 and one day, in the early evening, Frank was brought into booking by the sheriff's department. The charge was second-degree murder. He claimed that he got into a fight with an undocumented immigrant and shot him in self-defense. However, the evidence showed the victim was hit 3 times with a blunt object and shot in the back of the head, apparently from the kneeling position. This all taking place in an abandoned farmhouse that neither had any association with Frank being much bigger and stronger than the victim. His story didn't convince a jury, and he was found guilty and sentenced to life without parole. I was also working that day, and they had to carry him back to the jail. He was sobbing uncontrollably. Normally an inmate sentenced to state prison is transported within a week. They took Frank 3 hours later. I guess due to his prolific case, or maybe because of his size and suicidal risk. I saw a lot of people I knew pass through that jail during the 5 years I worked there, but I will never forget Frank. I know a guy who ran over his girlfriend's head with his car, twice, because he thought she was cheating on him. He's serving a life sentence now. While in prison, a much older woman who worked in the kitchen fell in love with him and they married. She doesn't work there anymore. He then converted to Islam and now whenever she visits, she has to be fully covered from head to toe. Whackers, both of them. My brother-in-law is in prison for life for killing his ex-friend with benefits who was married. It was really hard on the family, but he had a history of being mentally unstable and stalking women. For whatever reason, a local police department still hired him. When he got hired, I called the chief of chiefs in the area, who was a personal friend. Told him about the stalking and erratic behavior, and that he could not be trusted with a gun. No lie. 3 months later, right before Christmas, same guy calls to tell us that my brother-in-law had just confessed to murder. I haven't spoken to that friend since. He could have literally prevented this from happening, but he did nothing. Still makes me so sick to think about. He was an a-hole in school. Never gave a shit about doing the right thing. Always purposely pissing the teachers off. But his older brother was the opposite. Loved by everyone. An all-around goofy person. Worked with little kids in his free time and after graduation. He went into his older brother's room, held a gun to his head, and asked, "Are you feeling lucky?" and pulled the trigger. It was a huge loss to our community and school district. I believe the younger brother was released early from prison due to the downsizing during COVID. No idea where he is now. I said this a few times. Was offered a podcast spot on here. Amandy Patwell. Y'all can search it up. Her dad stabbed her over 30 times for dating white dude. If the name doesn't point to her ethnicity, she was Punjabi. The community was stunned, but not surprised. The dad was always a bit weird, but harsh. He was ingrained in family culture and self-image. How did I know her? She was my babysitter, and even if I was 5, my first crush. Her dad offered to drive her back to PG because she had moved out and she had spent time with her family in Vancouver, and he had offered to drive her back. He then proceeded to stab her 30 times and claim it was her committing suicide. She was barely entering her adult years, and he took her life to preserve his family image. He was granted day parole a few years back and was denied full parole because he hasn't shown that he has changed, and that who is to say he won't integrate back into the same society / characters who he based his ducked up belief in. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.